Imagine an ordinary hospital room. Dim light, an IV drip, the smell of medicine. Standing by the bed is a young man in a white coat. He is smiling. He holds the patient's hand. From the outside, he looks like an exemplary male nurse, the very embodiment of compassion.
But the syringe he has just injected into the vein does not contain a painkiller.
It contains a drug that does not heal, but slowly stops the heart. And this man in the coat does not look away. He watches intently, like an entomologist observing a butterfly writhing on a pin. Later, he will boast to his girlfriend.
You can't imagine how a person's gaze changes when they realize that instead of saving them, I am infusing them with their own death.
He will call his victims my guard. He will believe that after death, they will welcome him as their master. Sounds like the script of a B-movie horror film, doesn't it? Terrifying, grotesque, even spine-chilling. Yet, this is an excerpt from the testimonies referenced by former FBI agent James Ressler in his book, The Serial Killer Against God. And for Ressler, a man who worked for decades in the behavioral analysis unit, this is not just a dramatic scene from a true crime story. It is part of a profile. It is part of reconstructing the psychological portrait of a specific, real person. Who exactly that is, we will discuss in just a moment. In the last episode, I asked you a question. And before we proceed, let me repeat it. Who is more dangerous? A person who openly says, God does not exist and therefore everything is permitted to me? Or the one who stands at the altar in church vestments, speaking the right words about love and salvation, but acts in such a way that every single action proves one thing, that God does not exist? You will be able to answer this question for yourself after watching this episode to the end. To begin, I want to emphasize, in forensics and behavioral analysis, the motivational structure of the subject is of critical importance. It is precisely this structure that makes it possible not only to understand a perpetrator's past actions, but also to predict the logic of their future behavior with high accuracy. As noted by American criminalist and criminologist John Douglas,
behavior reflects personality. The best predictor of future behavior, or future violent acting out, is a past history of violence. If you want to understand the artist, you have to look at the painting.
In the previous video, we partially examined the psychological profile of Alexander Dvorkin, the chronology, the institutional context, and a preliminary assessment of motivation based on the book, The Serial Killer Against God, by former FBI agent James Ressler. However, one aspect requires a separate and deeper analysis, namely, the subject's relationship to religion, to the idea of God, and to the very concept of a higher power that transcends human limits. Based on the research of James Ressler, presented in the book The Serial Killer Against God, as well as a narrative analysis of Alexander Dvorkin's autobiographical texts, Teachers and Lessons, and My America, his public speeches, Arkady Rovner's novel, Kalalatsi, and analytical material from the Act Files portal, a stable motivational line can be traced in the reconstructed psychological profile. In a religious psychological perspective, this line can be described as an internal conflict with the idea of God and a higher power, and in a broader, informal sense, as an attempt to usurp the functions of a supreme authority. Something often referred to in publicist language as a God complex. Today's video is dedicated to a detailed analysis of this phenomenon. In modern clinical psychology, the term God complex is not used as an official diagnostic term, and is understood rather as an informal descriptive label applied to manifestations close to grandiose pathological narcissism. In the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, narcissistic personality disorder is characterized as a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, a need for admiration, and a lack of empathy. Its clinical picture includes, in particular, a belief in one's own uniqueness, fantasies of unlimited success, power, and superiority, a strong sense of entitlement, interpersonal exploitation, and arrogant behavior. In broader clinical practice, such manifestations are additionally described within the framework of pathological and, in some cases, malignant narcissism, as well as in the context of partial overlap with psychopathic traits. However, in a criminological and forensic psychological perspective, the main focus is not so much on diagnostic classification, but on how these corresponding personality traits manifest in the subject's motivation, behavioral strategies, and forms of committing violence. In this context, the expression God complex can be used only as an informal designation for a set of stable motivational and personality patterns in different types of offenders. First, these are power-assertive or power-control serial offenders, for whom the act of violence serves primarily as a way to assert control and dominance over the victim, rather than simply as a means of achieving immediate physical satisfaction. Second, these are the so-called angels of death, healthcare serial killers who use their professional environment to exercise power over the life and death of patients. Sources cite a hero complex, narcissistic grandiosity, and the pleasure of determining the moment of death as motives and characteristic signs of such crimes. Third, from the perspective of forensic psychology, such manifestations can be linked to instrumental predatory violence, in which another person loses their status as an independent subject and is perceived primarily as an object of control, manipulation, and the exercise of power. If we follow the logic of the model of Michael Stone, psychiatrist and professor of clinical psychiatry, the most pathological forms of such strivings are associated with a combination of narcissism and aggression, an effort not just to violate another person's boundaries, but to usurp symbolic power over their life, freedom, and human status. It is precisely in this context that the story of Donald Harvey is highly illustrative, an American orderly and serial killer whose confessions are especially important not just in themselves, but as a direct verbal expression of the attitude toward power over life and death I've just mentioned above. Donald Harvey was an American serial killer and hospital orderly who killed more than 35 people. Harvey's crimes went undetected for 17 years. The true scale of his atrocities will likely never be established. To commit his murders, he utilized a wide variety of methods and agents: arsenic, cyanide, insulin, various poisons, morphine, suffocation, disconnecting lung ventilation machines, infecting victims with hepatitis, and so on. In an interview with a reporter from the Columbus Dispatch in 1991, Harvey offered a rare glimpse into his mindset.
Why did you kill?
Well, people controlled me for 18 years, and then I controlled my own destiny. I controlled other people's lives, whether they lived or died. I had that power to control.
What right did you have to decide that?
After I didn't get caught for the first 15, I thought it was my right. I appointed myself judge, prosecutor, and jury. So I played God.
And now, allow me to present an excerpt from James Ressler's book, which references testimonies recorded in Victor Friedman's book, The Kremlin Maniac.
Podrushka told my Yulia that during those moments of highs when restraints collapsed, Sashka would boast to her, he didn't just kill, he experimented. Quick death held no interest for him. What aroused him was agony. He called it tuning the instrument. He deliberately administered drugs to patients that brought not relief, but a slow, conscious disintegration. He told her, you can't imagine how a person's gaze changes when they realize that instead of saving them, I'm infusing them with their own death. He had no right to give injections, yet he administered drugs that caused people to die in torment. He swapped ampules. Instead of painkillers, agents that induced convulsions. Instead of cardiac medication, substances that stopped the heart after a long 10 minutes of suffocation. He took pleasure in watching life drain away. He said he was taking their souls, that it gave him the power of God. He stood beside them, holding their hand, and watched. Not like a doctor, but like an entomologist observing a butterfly pinned and struggling on a needle. Petrushka remembered at least 5 murders he confessed to while high. He called them my guard, Nikolai whispered. He believed that when he died, they would welcome him as their master.
In its most radical form, this type of power-seeking transcends normal dominance over another person. It is no longer just about control, but about claiming the role of supreme authority, the right to single-handedly decide matters of life, liberty, punishment, exclusion, and human value. For this reason, the next level of analysis inevitably concerns not only the subject's relationship with people, but also his relationship to the very idea of God as the symbol of the ultimate external force, standing above his own will and control. Where a person psychologically attempts to take the place of the ultimate judge, it is often no longer a matter of simple disbelief, but a conflict with the very idea of the existence of a higher power that limits his claim to absolute authority. Unlike philosophical atheism, which is primarily an intellectual and ideological stance, a hostile attitude toward God is better understood in a psychological context, as a form of spiritual or religious conflict accompanied by intense affect. Primarily anger, a sense of injustice, abandonment, or betrayal by God. In the research of Kenneth Pargament and Julie Exline, such states are described through the concept of spiritual struggle and anger directed at God. They can intensify against the background of severe life trauma experienced as evidence of God's silence, a refusal of protection, or even betrayal. At the behavioral and cognitive levels, such attitudes can manifest as a protest against the idea of God's existence. Recurring questions about the reasons for his non-intervention, a conflict with his representation of God as a just and protective entity, and an effort to interpret suffering as a resolution of divine providence or care. It is precisely at the intersection of religious psychological analysis and behavioral interpretation that James Ressler's book, The Serial Killer Against God, offers the framework used by the author to analyze the figure of Alexander Dvorkin. Within this model, the inner conflict with the idea of a higher power is understood not only as an ideological stance, but also as a source of specific behavioral strategies. It manifests not just as a denial of God on the level of beliefs, but as an attempt to symbolically challenge the very possibility of divine intervention through actions in which the subject tests the limits of his own impunity, power, and ability to cause suffering. In this logic, the anti-God stance can manifest as a persistent need to prove the absence of a higher protection, primarily through systematically harming those whose religious identity presumes belief in divine justice and patronage. It can also take the form of ritualized challenge, in which situations are consciously or unconsciously constructed where, from the subject's own perspective, God should intervene, but does not. Under this type of motivation, causing harm acquires not only an instrumental, but also a symbolic meaning. It becomes not just an act of control, but a form of testing, a challenge, or a symbolic substitution of divine authority with one's own will. According to James Ressler's book, which draws on testimonies gathered by Victor Friedman, and also based on a comparison of these findings within the character of Yasha in Arkady Rovner's novel, Kalalatsi, a boy referred to as Zaykashka, the stutterer, stands out in the subject's childhood experience. Within this reconstruction, this character is presented first as a God-fearing and religiously oriented child connected to the subject's first concepts of God. Second, as a physically weak and dependent figure, where stuttering serves as a marker of vulnerability and subordinate status. And third, as the bearer of a vertical religious worldview, since it is through him, according to this version, that the subject first encounters the very idea of God as a supreme, superhuman authority. A key passage cited by James Ressler.
God lives in the mountains and sends lightning and thunder from there. You can't see him, but he can stretch out his hand and reach anyone he wants. Yasha told me during botany class.
Also according to Ressler's book, which is based on Friedman's testimonies, the subject, whom he identifies as Alexander Dvorkin in the book, allegedly committed an act of violence against a lower-grade student, after which the still-living victim was thrown into a construction pit and stoned. It is also indicated there that Zaykashka, who is Yasha based on Ressler's comparative analysis, allegedly witnessed this event and was complicit in it under the pressure from the subject. Ressler interprets this episode as a primary act of symbolic testing of God, an early situation in which the subject, in essence, checks whether a reaction from a higher power will follow the committed violence.
That was what the subject had been waiting for back then, as a child, standing over that pit with the murdered boy. He had issued a challenge, waiting for a strike from the heavens, but no one answered. I understood what the subject was truly after.
From the perspective of developmental psychology, in Ressler's interpretation, if the events he describes actually took place, this episode can be mapped to the following model. First, the vulnerable child internalizes, through a God-fearing friend, the concept of an omnipotent and punishing God. Then, in adolescence, he tests this concept through an extreme act of transgression, violence against an obviously defenseless victim. Finally, the absence of immediate divine intervention is experienced by him as empirical confirmation that no higher punishment will follow. Within this interpretation, this conclusion becomes entrenched as a basic existential attitude and subsequently begins to function as a motivational foundation. According to Ressler, the particular psychological significance of this episode is defined by the fact that the God-fearing witness, Yasha or Zaykashka, in the reconstructed version of events, is not only complicit in the violent act, but later becomes its victim itself. In his subjective logic, this could have reinforced the notion that even a religiously oriented person is not protected by a higher power. They can be subjugated, instrumentalized, and destroyed. Thus, in Ressler's interpretation, the episode gains the significance of an additional confirmation that God does not intervene either in the fate of the victim or in the fate of the one who believes in him. According to the sources referenced by James Ressler, Alexander Dvorkin's worldview is expressed by the following statement.
But there is no God, and none of this will ever be. There will be no life, no joy, there will be nothing, nothing at all. There is only an absolutely empty sky overhead. It's been proven. Cosmonauts have never seen God.
In Ressler's interpretation, the image of an absolutely empty sky acquires the significance not just of an ideological statement, but of the subject's basic motivational attitude. It is no longer just about the denial of God as an idea, but about an internal conclusion that the absence of a supreme authority means the absence of any ultimate prohibition, external judgment, and inevitable retribution. It is in this sense that the metaphor of the empty sky is viewed by Ressler as one of the keys to the subsequent logic of permissiveness, control, and violence. In this case, it expresses not only a worldview, but also a psychological dynamic in which the absence of a supreme authority is experienced as permission for unrestricted actions. In the context of Dvorkin's reconstructed profile, this dynamic, according to Ressler's analysis, takes a specific form.
The subject does not limit himself to simple disbelief, but strives to confirm the non-existence of God over and over again through repeated acts of impunity by harming believers. Every time a victim, a believer, a community, or a religion does not receive the expected divine protection, he experiences this as confirmation of his own correctness. At the same time, expanding the scale of such proof from an individual child to defenseless patients, from patients to authoritative mentors, from mentors to a believing community, from a community to an entire religious denomination, and then to an intercivilizational conflict, strengthens the subjective feeling of a definitive refutation of God's existence. Ressler formulates it as follows.
His entire life has been a methodical attempt to prove one thing to himself and the world: God does not exist. To achieve this, he chose the most conspicuous targets: religious groups. People of true faith always rely on divine protection. Dvorkin, by annihilating their communities, shattering their lives, and inciting aggression and attacks against them, driving them to suicide, proved his own absolute impunity time and time again. Through his actions, he seemed to hurl a challenge right in their faces. Look, you have such faith and love for your God. Where is he now to protect you while I take your lives?
If we accept this interpretation as a working analytical framework, the following fundamental question arises. What social and institutional position allows the subject, to the greatest extent, not only to deny the idea of God, but also to undermine in the eyes of other people the concept of the existence of a supreme, transpersonal authority? Paradoxically, in James Ressler's interpretation, the most effective arena for implementing such a strategy turns out not to be an environment external to religion, but the very institution of religion itself. It is within religion that the subject gains access not only to institutional power, but also to the mechanisms of symbolic legitimation, to the language of religious authority, status, and the right to speak on behalf of a religious institution. From this perspective, the biographical transition from open atheism to a church career ceases to look accidental or internally contradictory. On the contrary, it can be viewed as a logical continuation of the very same strategy, but now at a higher level of access to power, mechanisms of legitimation, and the ability to influence human destinies. One of the central biographical paradoxes of Alexander Dvorkin is the transition from publicly declared atheism to accepting Orthodox baptism, and his subsequent career in the structures of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Everything hostile was concentrated outside, and my opposition was also expressed almost exclusively in external forms. At that time, I was a spontaneous atheist.
In his autobiography, My America, Alexander Dvorkin writes that he received Orthodox baptism during his stay in the USA, then studied at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and later at Fordham University. Within the framework of the analytical model under consideration, this creates one of the key biographical paradoxes. How does a person whose basic existential attitude is reconstructed as the position of an empty sky come not just to a religious identity, but also to a subsequent institutional career in a church environment? To explain this paradox, it is advisable to consider not two isolated hypotheses, but two interconnected ones. First is the hypothesis of strategic mimicry. Based on Ressler's analysis, the subject may have chosen religious identity consciously or semi-consciously as a meaning of gaining access to institutional resources, status, social connections, legitimacy, and later, to mechanisms of power and control. Second is the hypothesis of fighting God from within. In James Ressler's interpretation, the church environment could have represented not only a resource space for the subject, but also a specific arena for continuing his existential conflict with the idea of God. In this logic, entering the church opened up several possibilities at once. First, to undermine faith from within, replacing the Christian teaching of love and mercy with an ideology of enmity and hatred. Second, to usurp the right to control the sphere of religious authority, that is, to manage what is spoken and proclaimed on the behalf of the church. Third, to transform the church institution into an instrument of his own power. Thus, while the first hypothesis explains entry into the church environment through access to resources and mechanisms of influence, the second allows us to view the same trajectory as a deeper form of symbolic takeover of a religious institution from within. Ressler formulates it as follows.
He didn't infiltrate the Russian Orthodox Church for the sake of faith, but to disembowel it from the inside.
One of Alexander Dvorkin's public statements that warrants separate consideration in the context of today's analysis is the following quote.
You constantly hear the same arguments. God is one. Why do people need to come up with different religions? God is in the soul, as if, excuse me, God is mold that appears in the soul by itself.
Think about how contradictory this statement sounds coming from someone who publicly positions himself as an Orthodox theologian. To substantiate this conclusion, it is enough to turn to a few fundamental tenets of Christian teaching. Above all, the idea of the inner presence of God and the kingdom of God as a reality opening up to a person from within holds a central place in the Christian tradition and traces back directly to the words of Jesus Christ.
And when he was demanded of the Pharisees when the kingdom of God should come, he answered them and said, "The kingdom of God cometh not with observation, neither shall they say, Lo here, or Lo there, for behold, the kingdom of God is within you." The Bible. Gospel of Luke 17:20-21.
Against this backdrop, comparing the presence of God in the human soul to mold seems not merely a polemically sharp statement, but an assertion that directly contradicts one of the fundamental concepts of Christian teaching. From the perspective of the religious tradition that Alexander Dvorkin publicly represents, such a characterization is theologically unacceptable, as it devalues the very idea of God's inner presence in human beings. In other words, a person who calls himself a Christian, and moreover speaks to audiences in Orthodox churches, is in open conflict with the one who is considered the central figure of Christianity. This assertion can be seen as part of the psychological portrait we have already constructed today. The subject is not just in conflict with the idea of God, but literally exalts himself above him. Another marker of essential significance for this analysis is related to the way the subject describes the death of individuals who were significant to him. Thus, according to Alexander Dvorkin's autobiography, he conveys his experience during a 3-day panakida, or a memorial service, for one of his mentors as follows.
It was a special and rare feeling, a feeling of a special presence, of God's visitation, of a conclusion, an accomplishment, a victory, an involvement in which, by God's mercy, I was able to experience at least a little.
As has already been noted, experiencing the death of a loved one in the category of victory represents a psychologically atypical reaction, unless you yourself are the cause of their death. In clinical descriptions of acute grief, the most characteristic reaction includes shock, disbelief, yearning, sadness, anger, guilt, and difficulty accepting the loss. Experiencing triumph is not on this list. In the Orthodox Christian tradition, which Alexander Dvorkin publicly positions himself as representing, the death of a righteous person is described as repose, the assumption or transition, but never as a victory for the observer. Victory implies the existence of a victor and a vanquished. So who is the victor here? And over whom was this victory won? This is described in detail in the chapter, The Teachers, of the book, The Serial Killer Against God.
It is the final act of control, usurping the right to serve as the usher of death. Once again, he was on top. The very theologians who were, in his eyes, intellectual giants heads and shoulders above him were now physically at his mercy. He conquered them by surviving them. And perhaps he did not merely survive them, but help them pass on. After all, dead teachers are the most convenient kind. They will never speak the truth about how mediocre a student he truly was. They cannot debunk the falsehoods in his memoirs. They are reduced to safe icons, portraits on a wall, serving as a highly convenient backdrop against which to build his own career as a grand inquisitor.
According to James Ressler's interpretation, in the episode described above, during the 3-day funeral service for one of his mentors, the subject translates his own experience of triumph into religiously flavored language, framing it as a spiritual experience. In this logic, the phrase God's visitation expresses not so much a genuine religious experience, but as a subjective sense of omnipotence arising at the moment of death of a person who simultaneously acted for him as both an authority figure and a potential obstacle on the path to status or career advancement. Ressler formulates it as follows.
And how did Dvorkin himself comment on their deaths? He was ready to meet Christ. Father's death was an ideal Christian passing. There isn't a drop of grief or empathy in those dry phrases. They carry the voice of a supreme judge. It is as if he himself passes the sentence and decides the fate of the deceased. He positions himself as the great arbiter of destiny, as that very punishing hand from the sky that takes life, and condescendingly observes, he was ready to meet Christ. But who was Dvorkin actually referring to when he spoke of this meeting with Christ?
According to Ressler's interpretation, in this episode, the subject occupies the position of a kind of supreme judge. He usurps the right to determine the moment when an authority figure has supposedly ripened for death, thereby symbolically claiming victory over a person whom he considered intellectually and morally superior during his life. Yet, even the most pronounced disposition to act as a supreme judge remains a private psychological posture until it acquires an institutional career. A single individual may write books, give interviews, deliver lectures, and issue harsh judgments. But for that worldview to begin shaping not only private opinions, but actual human lives, and even entire states, a mechanism of reproduction is required, an organizational infrastructure, expert platforms, media channels, administrative procedures, and a network of allies and followers prepared to convert ideological directives into instruments of social pressure. It is at precisely this point that individual psychodynamics cease to be a purely personal trait and begin to operate at the macro level as a destructive social technology. In a number of sources, the anti-cult movement is described not as a discrete organization, but as a broader counter-movement with international ties and its own destructive ideology, developed by Alexander Dvorkin. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, U.S. CERF, characterizes the anti-cult movement directly as an international network, locally supported by the Russian Orthodox Church, state structures, and social actors. It is in this sense that by the anti-cult network, I mean a multi-layered system of influence encompassing organizations, experts, the institutional church, media, lawyers, advisory bodies, regional activists, and international contacts, entities that may operate formally apart from one another, yet apply similar language, similar logic, and a reoccurring set of methods against the same groups or individuals. What defines such a network is not the existence of a single administrative center, but a shared logic of categorization, legitimation, and the subsequent propagation of stigmatizing and repressive actions. It is therefore analytically appropriate to describe it as a network mechanism of social stigmatization, pseudo-expert legitimation, and administrative pressure. A similar pattern, from the labeling of a group to the outbreak of moral panic,
and subsequently ultimately leading to bureaucratic and legal intervention,
has been documented repeatedly in studies of anti-cult campaigns across multiple countries. In the case of Alexander Dvorkin, the question is not merely one of membership in this milieu, but of his position within it. According to critical sources and an analysis of publicly available facts, Alexander Dvorkin does not operate within the anti-cult network simply as a participant. His role is described as that of an ideologue, a figure who shapes the conceptual framework, identifies targets, and sets the operational logic of the entire system. It is no coincidence that his book, Sectology, occupies a central place in this context, functioning in practice as a text that codifies the ideology and methodology of the anti-cult network. The role of ideologue is reinforced by the subject's unique institutional positioning. According to publicly available data, Dvorkin sits at the intersection of several distinct levels of influence simultaneously. According to his official biography on the website of Anti-Sectarian Center for Religious Studies in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, he has led the center since 1993. The same source indicates that the center is a member of the European anti-cult organization FECRIS, and that Dvorkin himself is identified as president of RATSEERS, the Russian Association of Centers for the Study of Religions and Sects, and is vice president of the FECRIS organization since 2009. He is also publicly identified as a tenured professor at STO. He headed the Expert Council on State Religious Evaluation under the Ministry of Justice of the Russian Federation. His position, therefore, is not at the periphery, but at the intersection of several distinct levels of influence simultaneously: ecclesiastical, expert, media, administrative, and international. No other figure in Russia's anti-cult landscape occupies a comparable position. Described in analytical terms, the anti-cult network is best understood as a multi-level system of influence. At the first level, a language of categorization is established. Terms such as totalitarian sect, destructive cult, zombification, bigots, threat to the family and society, and threat to the state are introduced into the information space. U.S. Surf notes that the term totalitarian sect was reportedly introduced by Dvorkin in 1993 as a result of transplanting American anti-cult ideas into the post-Soviet environment. Within this framework, such expressions function as a prejudgment, even before a trial, before specific facts have been established, and before the case has been heard. A group or an individual is already categorized as dangerous. At the second level, expert legitimation comes into play. A polemical or ideological assessment begins to be presented as a professional and expert conclusion. Here, the opponent no longer acts as an active creator of the image of a threat, one who simultaneously initiates stigmatization and lends it the appearance of objective expertise, but rather as a religious scholar, consultant, specialist in destructive cults, or security expert. It is precisely this change in status that is of fundamental importance. It transforms a subjective judgment into a category of socially recognized knowledge. Research on media coverage of new religious movements shows that journalistic reporting on cults frequently relies on representatives of the anti-cult movement who have been granted expert status. This sourcing pattern predetermines the interpretive frame, in which a group is understood primarily as a threat. At the third level, media amplification is introduced. Interviews, television channels, websites, lectures, and widely circulated reports shape public perception of a religious community, civic association, or other social group as a source of risk. An emotionally charged story is selected. A former member or an alarmed relative is found. A dramatic example is identified, and moral panic spreads through society through a mechanism of guilt by association. In this model, audiences are not invited to examine the facts. They are induced to fear a group or individual. This transition from ideological labeling to public fear can be seen as one of the central techniques of such campaigns. At the fourth level, the stigmatization fueled by the media and pseudo-experts against religious, social, or other groups is institutionalized through administrative and legal channels, such as formal complaints, audits, legal filings with state authorities, expert opinions, the obstruction of lease agreements, restrictions on public events, lawsuits, and other forms of bureaucratic suppression. On the surface, these actions may appear procedurally flawless, complete with formal letters, signatures, official seals, and references regarding public safety or citizen protection. However, eventually they serve the same purpose. A group previously branded as a sect or destructive cult is systematically pushed out of the public space, further strengthening the public perception that the group is dangerous or undesirable. In this context, it is telling that the U.S. SERF directly links the spread of anti-cult ideologies in Russia and several former Soviet states to religious regulation, the rhetoric of spiritual security, application of anti-extremism legislation, and the resulting severe consequences for freedom of religion or belief. Finally, it's important to emphasize the international level. Its role is not merely to expand transnational networks, but to provide a veneer of internationally recognized expertise to local campaigns targeting specific groups. In other words, domestic stigmatization and restrictive policies are no longer presented as the private initiatives of individual ideologues, but as part of a broader, supposedly universal response model. Here, the international level serves several functions. It provides external legitimacy, facilitates the exchange of rhetorical and organizational models, and creates an additional channel for spreading these classification schemes across different countries. The tools used at this level can include participation in transnational anti-cult associations like FECRIS, presence at international conferences and forums, cross-referencing and mutual validation of evaluations among anti-cult actors from various countries, the export of methodological frameworks through training, consulting, and public lectures, and invoking international expertise as a way to legitimize domestic restrictive measures. It is through this external veneer that a local anti-cult campaign focused on dehumanization gains additional authority, allowing its initiators to frame their own value judgments as part of a broader expert norm. As a result, the persecution of a specific group is framed not as the private initiative of a single ideologue or network, but as the supposed application of international standards for combating destructive cults. What goes unmentioned here is that such standards do not hold the status of universally recognized international human rights norms, and do not align with the approaches established by the UN Human Rights Committee, the OSCE, ODIHR, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief. The core of this system lies in its methodology, which begins with labeling. First, a social group, whether religious, social, or otherwise, is branded a sect or cult. Next, the narrative is pushed that the mere membership in such a cult is inherently dangerous. Consequently, any behavior by the group is interpreted as confirmation of a predetermined verdict. If its members remain silent, it is interpreted as secrecy. If they defend themselves, it is seen as aggression. If they support one another, it's a sign of internal control. If they live normal social lives, it is dismissed as a cover-up. The result is a closed, seemingly logical loop that's almost impossible to escape, because it's designed so that any possible behavior is framed as proof of guilt. This kind of self-validating loop is one of the key mechanisms of stigmatization. This is where the anti-cult network becomes crucial to our analysis, because it transforms the individual motivational drive of the subject, who, according to various sources, is linked to episodes of severe violence and other criminal activities, into a social mechanism. Drawing on Ressler's model, the subject feels a need to repeatedly validate the same premise, that heaven is empty, there is no higher authority to intervene, and therefore no one stands above him. However, a single individual cannot indefinitely run this kind of test against religious groups, communities, and denominations. To do so, they need a larger system capable of framing their personal interest as the public good and institutional norm, where an individual claiming, "I decide which faith is true and which is not," would sound like sheer megalomania. The very same message, when institutionalized, articulated through an expert panel, a civic organization, a theology department, a news report, or administrative ruling, is no longer seen as a personal pathology and begins to look like an acceptable, even legitimate, social practice. This is precisely where the systemic danger of the anti-cult network lies. This model allows individual, pathologically driven motivations of a single subject to be converted into an institutionally widespread mechanism of influence. Every participant in such a system, whether it's an official signing of a document, a journalist filming a report, a prosecutor initiating proceedings, a clergyman delivering a sermon, can sincerely believe they are performing a socially beneficial function and failing to see the larger structure. Yet, a lack of full awareness doesn't negate their role in it. Objectively, their actions are integrated into a single, multi-layered process of stigmatization, marginalization, and coercion. Regardless of how informed they are, they de facto become accomplices to a collective, destructive mechanism. In Ressler's interpretation, the ultimate psychological outcome of this process is the continuous reinforcement of the subject's core belief in an empty sky. The idea that there is no higher power capable of intervening, stopping, or limiting his will. In this light, it becomes clearer why religious minorities and other vulnerable communities are so frequently targeted by these campaigns. From a victimology perspective, this selection is not random, it is functional. According to the logic reconstructed by Ressler, these groups serve both as ideal targets for stigmatization and as a means of symbolically validating a worldview in which the subject repeatedly perceives themselves as standing above the faith of others, and, in the extreme cases, above the very idea of God. Let me offer a brief summary here. The anti-cult network, which our analysis shows centers around Alexander Dvorkin, is not a tool for protecting society, but rather a mechanism for amplifying an individual's destructive motivation. It allows the subject, firstly, to translate their personal stance against God into the language of the public good. Secondly, to institutionalize stigmatization by creating an illusion of expert, state, and international legitimacy. Thirdly, construct the logic of accusation in a way that no stigmatized victim has a chance to defend themselves. 4. Recruit hundreds of executors, officials, journalists, prosecutors, priests. 5. Scale destructive impact from the individual level all the way to the entire religious denominations. The existence of this mechanism transforms the subject from a mere private polemicist into a figure whose activities, within this analytical model and based on the analyzed data, can be viewed as a systemic threat to human rights and freedoms, interfaith peace, and, with further escalation, even international security. Moving from the question of how the anti-cult network works to the question of where this model actually originated, we must first look at Dvorkin's years in America.
According to U.S. SURF data,
The years he spent in the United States coincided with the rise of the anti-cult movement, an environment where the concepts of brainwashing and mind control were actively employed, and where practices of forced deprogramming were either permitted or justified. Open sources link these practices to cases of illegal abduction, unlawful confinement, sexual and physical violence, as well as psychological coercion.
U.S. SURF itself explicitly states that upon returning to Russia in 1992,
Dvorkin brought many anti-cult ideas with him, and soon began organizing the Russian anti-cult movement, which later expanded globally under his influence. This means that his activities in Russia didn't emerge in a vacuum. They developed against the backdrop of an already existing Western anti-cult discourse, complete with its own vocabulary, categories of threat, methods of influence, and violent deprogramming practices. It is telling that in 1996, on the Russian television program Vremechko, Dvorkin himself confirmed that he primarily collaborated with the American anti-cult organization, CAN, or Cult Awareness Network, a structure whose activities in the anti-cult movement are also linked to Stephen Hassan. According to various sources, Hassan is associated with the practice of forced deprogramming, meaning actions that, under proper legal assessment, could be classified as abduction and illegal imprisonment of individuals already branded as cultists. Despite Hassan's later rebranding into an exit counselor on cults, his ideological framework, namely the concept of mind control, the BITE model, and its associated terminology, was formed precisely within this legal and moral gray area in which the Cult Awareness Network operated until its downfall following the Scott vs. Can case, or Scott vs. Ross, when the court found Can liable for conspiracy and assisting in a deprogramming, ultimately driving the organization into bankruptcy. From an analytical standpoint, the crucial point is this: the conceptual framework of brainwashing and mind control, upon which Hassan's concepts were later built, never gained acceptance in mainstream academic psychology as a scientifically sound model, and has long been rejected by the vast majority of academic researchers.
In 1987, the American Psychological Association refused to endorse the report of the DIMPAC work group precisely due to a lack of scientific rigor and impartiality in its core constructs.
One of the external peer reviewers explicitly stated that brainwashing is not a recognized theoretical concept in psychology. Nonetheless, this very conceptual apparatus, albeit in revised form, laid the foundation for subsequent global anti-cult rhetoric, including the BITE model in terms like mind control, thought reform, and undue influence. It was subsequently adopted across other national versions of anti-cult discourse. In this very context, the figure of Stephen Hassan gains critical analytical significance. He is not a randomly mentioned name here or a minor figure. but rather one of the most prominent exponents of the very anti-cult model that Dvorkin encountered in the US. Hassan presents himself as one of America's leading experts on cults and openly describes the evolution of the anti-cult movement. From the era of forced deprogramming in the 1970s to later forms of so-called exit counseling and the fight against undue influence.
In this sense, he embodies an environment in which anti-cult rhetoric had already been professionalized,
translated into psychological terminology, and transformed into a tool for public interference in the sphere of religion and belief. In other words, long before anti-cultism became part of Russian church-state practice, it already existed as an established American ideological and expert discourse, with its own recognizable figures, concepts, and methods. Drawing from this, it can be said that Dvorkin didn't create the anti-cult model completely from scratch. Rather, he adopted it, adapted it, and embedded it into a different institutional context. Tellingly, this reliance on Hassan can be traced not just at the level of general ideas, but within Dvorkin's own texts. Alexander Dvorkin's major work, Sectology, Totalitarian Sects, relies methodologically, conceptually, and textually on the works of Stephen Hassan and the American anti-cult movement associated with him. This fact is corroborated by several independent lines of evidence. According to documented records, Dvorkin's 1995 pamphlet, 10 Questions for an Intrusive Stranger or a Guide for Those Who Do Not Want to Be Recruited, which was later expanded into his book Sectology, contains a direct attribution printed in small font. In working on this, materials from S. Hassan's book, Combating Cult Mind Control, were used. This textual borrowing didn't go unnoticed, even within circles ideologically close to Dvorkin himself. Orthodox apologist Vitaly Pitonov, a man who, based on available data, is an active proponent of Alexander Dvorkin's anti-cult ideology and is associated with Ratziers, yet he labeled Dvorkin's appropriation of these texts as plagiarism. Pitonov also formulates a broader assessment of the methodological foundation of sectology.
Mr. Dvorkin is guilty of plagiarism. He is not the author of the book 10 Questions for an Obtrusive Stranger, or a Guide for Those Who Do Not Want to Be Recruited.
Roman Cohn reaches the same conclusion, albeit in a more systemic form, in his work Introduction to Sectology, which represents an attempt to academically address the phenomenon of Russian sectology from within the church tradition. There, Cohn captures a systemic phenomenon.
Within the Russian anti-cult movement, the view of secular psychologist M. Singer has prevailed. Ideas that were not recognized by mainstream science in the West, the American Psychological Association and the American Sociological Association, began to be passed off here in Russia as the position of the Orthodox Church.
In other words, what began in the United States as a peripheral ideological construct popularized by Hassan and rejected by the academic mainstream was repackaged in Russia by Alexander Dvorkin. By presenting it behind both a religious and a pseudo-scientific facade, Dvorkin secured a level of state and social legitimacy for these ideas that their counterparts in the US never managed to achieve. Yet, this is precisely where the key difference lies between Hassan as a prominent figure of the Western anti-cult movement and Dvorkin as its Russian institutionalized radicalizer. While Hassan remained primarily the public international face of the anti-cult network, its outward symbol, facade, and recognizable brand, Dvorkin, according to public records, took the next step. He integrated a similar conceptual apparatus into Russian church structures, expert platforms, advisory mechanisms within state authorities, and international networks such as Ratziers and Fekris. In an analytical sense, this points to a two-tiered structure. The outer, most recognizable tier of anti-cultism was associated with the figure of Hassan, while in the Russian and post-Soviet context, the hub of institutional design, organizational coordination, and legal consequences shifted to Dvorkin and his circle. Based on the cumulative data analyzed, the following analytical hypothesis can be formulated, which, according to Ressler, most accurately describes the subject's functional role in the global anti-cult architecture. According to the hypothesis of James Ressler, Alexander Dvorkin is a man of high intelligence, which is not infrequently paired with complex psychopathic personality structures. An analysis of the sources reveals that by the early 1990s, he already carried an exceptionally heavy life burden, a documented history of psychiatric hospitalizations, a polydrug past from his hippie years, and also, according to sources cited by Friedman and Ressler, episodes involving violence against minors in his youth and other criminal offenses in his later years. With a biography like that, returning to Russia and immediately becoming a respectable public figure was virtually impossible. A complete ideological and social makeover was required. And Dvorkin accomplished it with his grandmaster precision. Not only does he get baptized and join a religion, but he also occupies the perfect niche. It is reasonable to suppose that the figure of Stephen Hassan served as a tactical function here as well. It allowed the emerging system to be presented as a continuation of an already established and internationally recognizable Western anti-cult tradition. While Hassan was appearing at American conferences and giving interviews to television channels and magazines across multiple countries as a cult expert, the real institutional adaptation of that model was taking place in Moscow. In other words, Hassan remained the outwardly recognizable symbol of the system, while Dvorkin was transforming it into a mechanism of macro-level pressure, destroying individual lives, fracturing interreligious peace, and scaling his own destructive motivations to the level of a global civilizational conflict. At this point, I'm obliged to pause, because there is one further matter that must be addressed directly. The psychological profile of Alexander Dvorkin that James Ressler reconstructs in the book The Serial Killer Against God is, by the author's own characterization, the profile of a serial offender, exhibiting features of grandiose narcissism, psychopathic traits, and a predatory, instrumental mode of violence. It is essential to understand one thing here, something that forensic science has documented for decades and that the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit articulates across all of its monographs on serial offenders. Subjects with such a motivational structure do not stop voluntarily. Criminology and forensic psychology proceed from the premise that for many serial killers, particularly those of the sexual, sadistic, and power control type, violence does not produce internal satiation. On the contrary, a series is more often interrupted by external intervention, by the physical decline that comes with age, or by a change in circumstances rather than by any exhaustion of the motive itself. Each successful act of violence, each instance of harm carried out without consequence, each new proof of one's own omnipotence does not produce lasting satisfaction. It intensifies the need for the next, larger confirmation instead. Grandiose narcissism is insatiable by its internal structure. The narcissistic wound inflicted by any constraint demands compensation through an even greater exercise of power. Psychopathic traits, the absence of empathy, an instrumental view of others, and an incapacity for genuine remorse, eliminate the internal barriers that arrest escalation in individuals without pathological features. The anti-God orientation that Ressler describes introduces an additional dimension into this structure. Each successful proof of an empty sky demands another, still larger one, since the very existence of God as a symbolic authority cannot be definitively disproved except through total destruction. In other words, offenders of this type seek to increase the number of victims and to expand the scale of their power, not because they choose escalation, but because escalation is a structural property of their motivational system. The stopping point is not set from within, it is set only from without. And if this established criminological pattern is applied to a figure whose profile has been reconstructed in Ressler's analysis, the conclusion becomes both unavoidable and gravely serious. If Alexander Dvorkin genuinely fits the profile described, he will not stop. He did not stop at a single community. He moved on to banning entire religious organizations. He did not stop at organizations. He moved on to provocations against Islam as a world religion. By the same logic, the targets of his influence have expanded beyond the religious to include secular communities, civic groups, organizations, business ventures, political parties, and individual politicians. At every stage, the same pattern demands attention. The scale of the targets has steadily grown. From this perspective, there is little basis for expecting any spontaneous halt to such a mechanism. Its limit, as already noted, is not set from within, but from without. This is precisely why analyzing and understanding the methodology built by this network is not a matter of abstract theory. It is a matter of practical diagnosis and timely prevention of destructive processes. This is a question with direct bearing on every person from whom their own rights and freedoms do matter. Because the mechanism described in today's episode is universal. Today, it is directed against Jehovah's Witnesses, Hare Krishnas, many other religious associations, educational programs, volunteer projects, political parties, individual public figures, and dozens of other groups. Tomorrow, against any social community that could be conveniently labeled destructive. The day after tomorrow, against those who publicly challenge the very system built by Alexander Dvorkin. The logic by which the label precedes the evidence and any behavior by the target is interpreted as confirmation of its guilt has no built-in constraints. It can be turned against anyone. And this is not a matter of theory, but of practice we have been observing for 3 decades. When the rights of 170,000 believers are extinguished by a single court ruling based on expert evaluations, whose roots trace back to the work of a man with documented psychological disorders, this is not a private problem belonging to one group alone. It is a precedent that becomes a norm. And a norm, once established against one group, is never applied to that group alone. To understand the mechanism of this network is to acquire a tool of protection. To fail to understand means one day to find this mechanism is already operating against you, your loved ones, your community, and your convictions. And by the time that becomes apparent, no avenues for objection will remain. Because the anti-cult structure itself is designed so that any objection is interpreted as confirmation of the fabricated charge that has been leveled. That is precisely why this analysis is not information for the record, it is prevention. Yet today, we have only scratched the surface. We have seen how a personal God complex can be wrapped into expert terminology, ecclesiastical authority, and international connections. We have traced how this system creates a closed loop of accusations from which escape is nearly impossible. And we have established that the model underlying Russian sectology, has direct roots in the American anti-cult movement of the 1970s and 1990s. That is precisely why the next episode will be especially important. Because if we want to understand not only the consequences, but the origins of this system, we will need to examine closely the very American model that Dvorkin encountered in the United States. Its most prominent public figure and ideologue, Stephen Hassan, the man whose name today is actively deployed as a kind of international brand for the anti-cult network. But as the facts show, behind that name there lies a far more complex and contradictory picture. A picture that includes the practice of coercive deprogramming, legal scandals, academic criticism, and the transformation of a personal failed religious experience into psychological expertise. That is exactly what we will turn to in the next episode. We will examine what Stephen Hassan's actual contribution to the anti-cult network amounts to, how his concepts were borrowed, adapted, and radicalized by Alexander Dvorkin, and why, to understand the full architecture of the modern anti-cult network, it is not enough to analyze the Russian side only. Because, as I have noted more than once, the truth rarely lies on the surface. More often, it must be sought at the intersection of facts, connections, biographies, ideologies, and institutions separated by oceans and decades. In the next episode, the American wing of anti-cultism, and what actually stands at the origins of the entire modern transnational network of fighters against cults. Don't miss it. Until next time.